Hello, welcome to my channel. Another drawing of the Mandalorian. I've already done a couple of those, and this one is also in charcoal, but this one is more of a close-up with more details on the helmet. Let's have a look. Doing the sketch first, as usual. I'm going to do it in two stages. First I'm going to do a little bit of work with a graphite pencil, and this is my trusty Stadler HB graphite pencil that I use for most of the sketches. The size of the paper is, as usual, 9 × 12 inches. The paper is about 190 GSM, it's fairly smooth. I'm going to do the sketch of the helmet first, not a super detailed one, just some of the main parts. It's going to be like a vignette, so I'm not going to draw all the way to the edge of the paper. I'm just going to draw a little bit of his shoulders and some of his gear. The top part of that plate will be visible, and the strap. And now that I've done that sketch, I'm going to go in a little bit more boldly with some darker lines to define that edge a bit better and to make it a bit smoother and a bit more curved. And I'm doing this with a black colored pencil. The problem when drawing these things that require precision when recording is that you have to change the angle often, and you have to rotate the drawing. So I tried not to do that too much, because that would make it difficult for you to view the drawing process. But I will be rotating the drawing a little bit, because sometimes it just helps me create nice smooth lines or curved lines or straight lines, whatever it is that I'm trying to achieve. And the helmet has a lot of those, so it's not easy drawing that type of thing when you're recording. And I normally use a top-down recording method, which is good for these kind of videos and tutorials, but at the same time it has its limitations. Let me just get back to explaining what I was doing. I used a woodless charcoal pencil to draw some of the darker lines, and now I'm shading the top part of the helmet, or the dome of the helmet, with vine charcoal. Vine charcoal is softer, it doesn't really stick to the surface of the paper, so it's going to be easily moved around. And I'm now using a soft brush to move that vine charcoal so that I can make these soft transitions. So that's one of the things that you have to try to achieve when you're drawing metallic surfaces. There's going to be these highlights, and there's going to be transitions between the lighter and darker areas. And if the object is smooth, it's very important to try to avoid texture. Now, metal does have some texture, or at least some of it does, and sometimes you can even deliberately create more texture if you want the helmet to look like it has sustained some damage, or it's worn out and older, like I did in my previous video. But here we want a fairly smooth helmet, so I'm going to try to minimize the texture. Now, because vine charcoal usually isn't dark enough especially when you start spreading it around and blending it, I have to combine it with charcoal pencils. Charcoal pencils are made of compressed charcoal, and they're a little bit darker. So now I'm adding a little bit of value to the left side of the helmet, so that I can make a nice transition here from the darker area to the lighter area and the highlight at the top. So let me just say a few words on how I create these shiny parts or highlights on the helmet. The best way to create highlights when you're working with charcoal or graphite or any other similar medium is to reserve the white space. Just leave the area white. Of course, you can bring back the white areas by erasing, but to make these smooth transitions, it's usually better to reserve the white space. And you shade the darker areas first, and then you gently push the charcoal towards the lighter areas, and that way you leave those highlights and you create a smooth transition to that highlight. So that was my approach here, and that's what I'm going to do on the other side of the helmet as well. I shaded the darker areas. I'm going to start moving the charcoal from the darker areas to the lighter areas, leaving the white space in the middle. And that's going to be my highlight. So now I'm moving on to the lower part of the left side of the helmet. And this is a bit of a complex shape with some complex shadows. So shading it is not going to be as easy as it seems. When you look at Mandalorian's helmet, it seems like it's not going to be a very complicated drawing. You know, it seems like it's going to be a lot simpler than just a regular portrait. But like I said, there are a lot of these shapes with shadows of their own, and you need to shade them and draw the highlights so that you can explain that shape to the viewer. Otherwise, it's just going to look kind of confusing. And while you're shading, obviously the light source varies from one drawing to another, but the light is usually coming from above in most cases, and that's where most of the highlights will be. So if you look at these smaller areas, like for example around these openings for the eyes, the top part of that surface, which is facing upwards, is going to be lighter, and the sides, which I'm shading now, are going to be a lot darker. That's because they're facing away from the light source. And this part of the helmet has kind of a dint inside where the cheeks are, and that's why I had to shade that a little bit darker. And now I'm shading in between, inside this opening of the helmet and the rim above it. So I'm trying to define that darker area a little bit. And for those darker areas, I'm mostly going to be using soft charcoal pencil. As for my pencils, right now I'm also using a pencil eraser to draw some of the highlights, to enhance that contrast so that everything can appear as though it were made out of metal. So a word or two about my pencils. These are Morrison woodless charcoal pencils. And just like with all of my materials, I always stress that brands are not very important. You can use any brand of a pencil, but I just prefer woodless charcoal pencils because they can be sharpened really well, and when you draw things that require precision like this, it's good to have a nice sharp tip on your pencil. I normally use two grades, the medium one and the soft one, and I use the medium charcoal pencil and the vine charcoal for probably 98% of the drawing process. But I tend to reserve the soft charcoal pencil for the darkest areas. Now, how much of those dark areas will be depends on the drawing itself. But to create a nice range of value, it's always a good idea to use the darkest darks and the lightest lights very sparingly. Because that way, your lightest lights and your darkest darks will have a much stronger effect. So now I'm doing the same thing on the dome, on the right side of the dome of the helmet that I did on the left. And you can see what a nice transition I'm achieving with very, very little texture. There's a bit of texture here on the right side because I had to use some medium charcoal pencil there, but I'm going to smooth it out using brushes and tortillons because I want a nice smooth transition from the darkest area to these highlights that look like they're reflecting light from above. And now that dome of the helmet it really looks as though it's made out of smooth metal. And the middle part of it looks like it's raised slightly above the rest of it. That's again because of the shading. So whenever you're shading, whenever you draw a line, you have to understand that you usually can't just leave a line when you're drawing, because a line has to mean something. A line has to represent a shape. That's why you have to shade around the line. The line is going to have a shadow and a lighter side, just like any other shape. And that's how we make an object like this look more three-dimensional, and that's how we give it more depth. So that when you're looking at the paper, it feels like it's something that's popping out of the paper. It almost feels real. Anyway, this right side of the helmet is a little bit lighter in terms of value. So I'm going to use less of that compressed charcoal or charcoal pencils on it, and it's going to be more vine charcoal. This area here in the middle is very dark, and again I have to make sure that I shade this so that these transitions make sense in terms of lighting and shadows. We have to, when we look at this shape, we have to feel like this part around the cheeks of the helmet, if you want to call them that, is sunken inside, and the part around the eyes is kind of protruding forward a little bit. The area here is going to be under the helmet, is going to be darker, and I want to make the area in around the eyes, where the face is hidden, a lot darker. So I'm going to use a bit more of the soft charcoal pencil there. So I'm just cleaning up a little bit because I want the edges to be fairly clean. And now I'm going to draw a small highlight here inside this darker area of the helmet. I'm just going to use my pencil eraser to draw a small highlight there, like maybe it's reflecting a little bit of light. I'm using a Kohinoor pencil eraser for that. I normally use a combination of two types of erasers, the kneaded eraser and a pencil eraser. The kneaded eraser is Faber-Castell, and I use it both during the drawing process and for the cleaning up. I tend to prefer using the kneaded eraser for cleaning up because it doesn't leave any residue. But for precision drawing of these highlights, I like to use the pencil eraser in most cases. The pencil eraser allows you to use the eraser as you would a pencil. And that's another thing to understand about erasers, is that when you're drawing realistic drawings like this, where there's a lot of shading and where you need to show a lot of transitions between areas of lighter and darker value, the erasers are drawing tools. That's their primary purpose. They're not so much for correcting mistakes and cleaning up. They are actually a drawing tool, just like a charcoal pencil. Now, some people also prefer to use graphite, and a drawing like this can be done in graphite just as well, but I just prefer charcoal because it's a little bit faster to work with and it's easier to create these darker areas and smoother transitions. That said, charcoal is messier, so that's one of the things that you have to adapt to when you're working with this medium. But anyway, the helmet itself is done, and now I'm moving on to this robe. There's going to be a lot of these folds in the robe, and I'm going to go over this area a little bit more quickly because I mostly wanted to focus on the helmet. So I drew a lot of indications of these folds in that robe, which is wrapped around the neck and the shoulders. And like I said, I first made those indications, and now I'm going to cover it with a bit of vine charcoal to establish some base value, and also to create a smoother transition towards the edge of my drawing, because I want to create a vignette. I want the edges of the drawing to fade towards the whiter area, and as they normally do when you draw vignettes. And I like drawing vignettes because they allow you to choose which parts of your subjects you want to include, and they give you more freedom when adjusting your composition. But anyway, now I'm moving on with the charcoal pencil, and now I'm shading these folds in that robe, and I'm defining some of the darker areas, which are going to be the shadow areas in between those folds, and the raised areas are going to be lighter. But while I'm doing that, I'm also adding a bit of texture so that it looks more like it's made out of cloth. So in addition to the range of value, it's also important to have a range of textures, or a variety of textures, and I want that robe to have more of a rough texture. I'm going to try to create that rough texture by allowing my pencil to create a texture in the combination with the grain of the paper, and then I'm going to draw some highlights on top, again trying to create a bit of texture using the pencil eraser as well. So basically I just want to make it look like a real robe that's made out of the material that robes are normally made out of, and not out of metal or leather or some other material. I want to make it look like cloth. The area just under the helmet is going to be a bit darker, so I don't really need to define too many details there. I just have to make it darker, and I used some soft charcoal pencil there to define that area and to kind of separate it from the light folds in that robe, which are kind of sticking out. And there's an armor plate here, so I have to shade that so that it's a bit smoother, kind of like the helmet. And I'm continuing with the shading of the robe. It's important to create a nice range of value here so that these folds look like they're really deep, like there's a lot of shadow there in between. And I'm also trying to define this plate this armor on his chest a bit more, using a combination of brushes and tortillons to spread the charcoal, because they allow for these smoother transitions. I'm just drawing some highlights again using a pencil eraser, trying to make those folds more three-dimensional so that they're kind of sticking outwards a little bit more. You can see that occasionally I also use another pencil to clean up some of the edges. That's a black colored pencil. For some of the finer details, I will use a black colored pencil to clean up some of the edges and to draw some of the tiniest details and finest lines. But like I said, most of the drawing process is done with charcoal. Now I'm drawing some details on this leather belt, and there's a buckle here. That's going to be lighter, but there's going to be shadow under it. And I'm going to have to shade this part of the material, or this part of the equipment, as though it's made out of a different type of material. In this case it's leather, and with a few of these metallic parts. Just adding a few more details to this metal part of the belt, and shading it a little bit so that I can leave a few highlights. So these are just some of the finishing touches. These straps or belts have some seams on them, so I'm trying to leave that area lighter and then work around them with a black colored pencil to define all of these tiny details. I don't really think I would be able to do that with a charcoal pencil, or at least not with as much precision as I'm doing now. That should do it. There's always a lot of cleaning up to be done when you're working with charcoal, and the kneaded eraser is the perfect tool for that because it doesn't leave any residue. This is the finished drawing. I'm going to put my signature in the lower left corner, and that's it for another drawing of the Mandalorian. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other Mandalorian drawings and Star Wars drawings, or any other drawing videos that I made so far. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to see longer videos, you can also check out my Patreon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.